Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to everyone who's coming. It makes me feel very warm and fuzzy to see all these many friends, people, and mentors here. You do not need the handout for this presentation. What we've done with the handout is a background of the project and a short bibliography for those less familiar with the field, with this specific field. I feel like I should have cited more or less everyone on this call, but it's a basic starting point for those less familiar. You do not need to consult it during the presentation.
But there is a link to the project and an announcement
Exactly.
of the conference.
And to the conference, which will be happening. So that's on the handout, a bit more information to look at after. So today's presentation is entirely a product of our current project, which is called Dissemination, Ownership and Reading of Music in Early Modern Europe. It's a 5-year project, originally assessed by the European Research Council, then funded through the UKRI guarantee. We're currently now 4th year, and this is a very exciting moment for us. It's the first time we're sort of drawing larger conclusions from the material we've been working on over the last 4 years. And we're very much looking forward to discussing some of these with you all. We, that is the project team. So apart from myself, we have 2 postdocs who have been working on the project since the beginning. Louisa Hunter-Bradley, who you will hear from later, and Katie McKeogh, who's also here. As Katie is currently on parental leave, we have the added luxury of another postdoc, Anna-Louise Gilbert, who's also joined the call, a book historian and wizard with databases, who already in this short time has proved incredibly helpful to us and the project and also to today's presentation. So thank you. Just want to say that the work we're presenting today is the result of much collaborative work, and I want to stress that while some of the conclusions and contextualization might be individual assessments, the data we work with as much of as any of the resulting discussions are entirely collaborative. We will refrain from referring to each other all the time throughout the paper, but this should be implicitly understood. I'll give me a quick overview of what we'll be doing today. I will introduce the project first, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes. Some of you know it better than others, so from some it might be more of a reminder, for others an introduction to the project. Then we have 3 main themes that we've seen arising from the data so far that we wanted to focus on. Questions of text changes or additions to the text, secondly, interactions with the music, and finally, the topic of in-house corrections versus user annotations and some conclusions, before we look forward to some questions and discussions. Due to the specific circumstances of having a 1-month-old baby, I will be presenting Katie's paper, but she's here for the part of the discussion. Hopefully, if Clara allows, we'll be partaking in that. Now, the project. The very basic question that really drove this project was, who owned and more specifically used music books in the 16th century, and how did they interact with them? Probably everyone here is aware of the increase in the available musical material throughout the 16th century, partially thanks to the expansion of music printing. We know over time more printers entered the market, more books became available. What we do not know, apart from individual stories, is who used them and how, who bought them. What did it mean to own printed books, and how would you use them in practice, whether that practice might be study, performance, or collecting? Our focus lies on printed books, not because they're in any way considered superior or more important than manuscripts in the 16th century. We are firm proponents of understanding printed music as one way of disseminating musical material in a shared space with oral transmission and manuscripts. Why we are focusing on the printed book are mainly 3 elements. First, the printed, for all its shortcomings, printing came with the possibility to quickly produce more copies. Secondly, the fact that for many of those copies, in contrast to manuscripts, we have very little information of their provenance or use. And finally, this is linked to the 3rd reason, which is that printed books have traditionally not been studied from the perspective of their consumption broadly. For obvious reasons, much effort went into understanding their production, the technology, the financing, how it all worked. And in fact, the work we do now is only possible thanks to the enormous efforts of those who worked on cataloguing individual printers' works, including Stanley Borman, Jim Bernstein, Mary Lewis, Dan Hertz, the team behind VDM, Andreas here today, to name just a few. Well, of course, their focus had to be on the edition basis, which books were printed by whom, in what way. But in fact, some of them already gave great attention to the surviving copies, and we are indebted to their work both methodologically as well as by integrating their findings into our own dataset. This is the change sort of from an edition-based to copy-based scholarship. Because what we need to do to understand the consumption of music books, their ownership and use, is to move away from edition-based work, where we understand who printed what and what these books were made, to the copy-based work, where each individual surviving copy, and to some extent not surviving copy, is treated as an individual item with its unique story. There's, of course, been precedents for this kind of work, not only in the printers' catalogues, but also in the incredible work of, for example, Royston Gustafsson, John Metz, John Milsom, Birgit Lodes, recently Samantha Arten, and Antonio Chimotti, who have all followed the traces of individual copies, usually of particular editions. You'll find some of these names on our handouts and some more. What we're aiming to do is to create a much bigger picture of surviving music books, which is now a possibility thanks to digital tools at our disposal, and try and assess across many more samples whether there are patterns and trends in how music books are used. Going back to the title of our project, we looked in 3 areas: the dissemination, so broadly speaking, how far music books traveled, on which of the routes; the ownership, who owned them and what we can find out about them; and the reading or use. For all these, we are predominantly relying on assessing individual music books that survive for traces of their own history. Now, of course, when we write this up and when we research these topics, we have to combine it with evidence from other sources, principally booksellers' catalogues, wills. For today, we really want to focus what the books can tell us and how we record what they tell us and what sort of bigger stories are emerging from those individual interactions. For that, we also draw heavily on history of book, on book scholarship, on marginalia, on the history of reading, to bring this together with sort of music-specific scholarship. So the data we've collected, I'll focus briefly on the database because we've had all these questions and then we've tried to collect data as widely as possible and try to see which questions arise from the data and which ones we can answer. We have our main source of books we're still trying to look at, books of polyphony printed between 1500 and 1545 across all of Europe. There's various reasons for this particular choice. Of course, for assessing musical literacy or the role of printed music in early modern Europe, there's many other types of sources of equal or even greater importance, including liturgical books, music theory books, song sheets. However, many of those have a much more clearly defined readership and use. They're used in churches, clearly in educational settings. Polyphonic music books do not necessarily have such a clearly defined use. Plus, they offer us a cross-type of genres, languages, places of printing. Moreover, the first half of the 16th century, sort of our incunabula period, gives us a manageable amount of books. 450 editions of polyphonic music printing, which survive in just over 2,000 copies. 2 further things are important to note. When we write and research these, we of course look at polyphony beyond those years, as well as often at non-polyphonic music books to complete the picture. But the idea of our methodology is that it could be used on any type of book to describe it. Our dataset is simply the sample that we try to assess as a whole, as closely as possible as we can get. And we hope that if others agree with the way we describe these traces of music books, that our methodology can be used beyond these particular books. Now, for these 2,000 copies, our basic premises is that we record everything that happened to an individual book after it left the press. More precisely, after it left a printing press. I will talk about in-house corrections later today. In the library, we go sort of through the books from beginning to end. So that will include bindings, anything to do with toolings, covering material, furniture, would have any type of interaction with the liminal material, any annotation in the paste downs, book plates, inserted text. We record annotations into prefaces. And then we record the annotations with the actual core part of the book, with the music, annotations to text underlay, changes, corrections. We record additional music and something we call aid to orientation in the book, such as manuscripts. How we record it? Oh, we also record very occasional paw prints. Now, how do we record it? You'll be glad to hear today I will spare you the technical details of our database, which you can read up on in an article cited on the handout. In very short, together with our digital humanities partner Agile, we've developed a TI database that allows us to record all these interactions that I'm mentioning here in a flexible way, giving us the possibility to react to the individuality of interactions while developing some bigger groupings and so-called tags to classify them and make them searchable. It was important to us to work and to speak to RISM. So we have used the copy ID. Every single copy that is mentioned in RISM has a particular copy ID, which RISM now has also made visible on their online catalog. And we would like to thank RISM for their collaboration on this. The other database we took much inspiration from is MEI, Material Evidence in Incunabula, which records annotations and interactions in non-music books. So we expanded that by using various other methodologies to include music. For now, this data is recorded as TI-LXML files, already openly accessible through GitHub if someone wants to have a look. We're now working on a user interface that will make searching the data more intuitive for those of us who do not want to work with raw XML files. And we will share widely in the next year, hopefully, when this is accessible. In preparation for this talk, we've been starting to query the data across the many files and are now seeing first trends and results. Some of those we will present today. So basically, we had a lot of questions that we tried to answer, but we then went away and tried to capture any interaction of the book without being led by those questions when we capture the interactions, and are now trying to go back and seeing which questions might come up or which might be able to answer from this data. So these have become the main categories that any type of interaction we record, we annotate with. Everything we try and put in either a bucket of ownership or annotation. And within that, we divide ownership into current and former ownership. So if someone is not interested in the current library stamps, we can blank those out. If you are particularly interested in current library stamps, you can also get those out. Annotations, we divide into text underlay, interaction with the music, interaction with the liminal material, and additional music. You can also full text search the entire text. Then each of these interactions is described and, where possible, transcribed. For querying the data, we then combine this with information about the edition, for example, printer, place of printing, to allow us a much wider range of queries. This looks like this in practice. So if we want to know where all the big books printed by Petrucci go, we have to obviously input the fact that this is a book by Petrucci, and then have all the destinations in a way, or where all the books printed in Germany move to. Or when it comes to ownership, we can now ask questions of whether we find any female owners having tagged the owners in such a way, or who owned all the Motörhead books if there are any known owners, or sort by a former owner to see everything they owned. And there's so many questions we'd like to ask about reading. For example, show me all madrigal books that have annotations by a certain hand, show me all copies that have changes to the music, all Motörhead books that have changes to the text, or just filter all books that have extra music added. So this is sort of the broad outlines of what we've tried to capture. We will today mainly talk about this last category of reading. We've already had a couple of workshops, which many of you have attended, on dissemination questions. There's also a forthcoming special issue of a journal on the dissemination of music. The widest conclusion we can draw there is that there are incredibly different survival patterns, which are influenced by various things, as I will mention shortly. And we can see certain dissemination patterns by certain publishers. So that's sort of one of the areas. Then on ownership, we can add some books to already known collections, and many of those known to you. We have some new individual names which are tagged as person name and can start to be searched in the database. We've now seen about half of those that we've set out to see. So that's roughly 1,000 books, either as scans, but predominantly in real. These have come from libraries across Europe and the United States. They crucially also present a cross-section of different printers and genres. So while still not complete, we feel we can tentatively draw some wider observations and importantly focus on areas that have become of more interest to us, those that have become more frequent or less frequent than we expected. Of course, each individual book has its own story, and each interaction with the book deserves unique attention. So our process is a constant back and forth between trying to see the wider data, what might there be trends or interesting habits we could observe, versus understanding one particular example in a lot of detail. We're also acutely aware that there are many factors that influence what we see. One is, and the biggest is, of course, survival. I've spoken previously at Madren last about what survives and what does not. And it's so interesting to think in every sort of genre what might survive. To just give an example, for various reasons, which I'm happy to discuss, German anthologies of sacred music have a much higher rate of survival than, say, mass books printed in France. These reasons have to do with genre, with size, with distribution patterns, with library policies, politics over the centuries, wars, destructions. So survival is incredibly uneven. We know this, and obviously our observations are limited to what we have, but we try to keep these caveats in mind. Now, we have various case studies that we've drawn out from the data. You're the first ones to hear these today. And let us start with the interactions of music. Sorry, I'll go back to this. There's three main case studies. One is sort of the text underlay, the next the interactions with the music itself, and the third one in-house corrections. We'll start with the interactions with the text. This was now mainly compiled by Katie McKeogh, who's here today, and you will hear her voice through me, her written voice. I've added some further examples since you have left. Just to introduce Katie to those of you who don't know her, she's a religious and cultural historian and a book historian who joined King's after a decade at Oxford, where after her PhD she held a JRF in history. Her work is principally concerned with the cultural impact of religious change in Britain and beyond in the 16th and early 17th centuries. Her previous research has focused on English Catholicism, in particular the circle of the book collector and outspoken recusant Sir Thomas Tresham. So you might not be particularly surprised to hear that Katie took an interest in textual changes, especially those occurring in books of sacred music. The two main categories for text changes or additions in sacred publications at the time are either that sparsely printed underlay is supplied by hand or is positioned more clearly, and secondly, that music used liturgically, mainly mass settings and sacred motets, shows some evidence of doctrinally motivated text changes. What is surprising, though, in both cases is that overall examples are relatively sparse. This is particularly surprising to a book historian like Katie, who's seen lots of interactions in other types of books, so was surprised to see the lower level of interactions in our music books. Especially this is surprising as in so many printed books, or masses in particular, underlay is far from clear and syllable placing usually not at all evident. Similarly, for the 16th century, you might expect many more examples of textual changes motivated by religious changes. This relative sparsity is a result mainly of the types of copies that survive today, coupled with the tendency of acquiring clean copies, especially in larger libraries. We've certainly found that smaller libraries where copies have ended up, for example, from local churches, rather than acquired through book dealers or auctions, tend to have many more annotations overall, especially also when it comes to text underlay. Analysis of the copies where religious change is visible offers fascinating case studies. When we get closer to the completion of the database, we will be able to provide more statistical evidence for the support of this impression, but this evidence will only be meaningful alongside qualitative analysis and contextualization, and hence a little bit of a deep dive. The British Library copy of the Liber Quindecim Missarum Petreius Nuremberg 1539 has textual changes in its contratenor, tenor, and bassus part books. The absence of such changes in the cantus should not be taken as meaningful. It simply does not contain the relevant printed text. In these books, the Gloria of Josquin's Missa Beata Virgine, which includes addresses to Mary not usually featured in the text, has been altered. In each part book, the subject of Marian addresses has been changed to either God in the form of tuam or the Church in the form of ecclesia. The way the printed text has been cancelled is as revealing here as the inserted text. The word Mariam has been cancelled with a neat double line strike through, rendering it still legible. We know that the book was being used in Germany, where sharing church space between confessions at time took place. Moreover, Lutheranism did not make an enemy of Mary nor of the Latin Mass, and the use of the standard Latin texted Mass settings in the part books within Lutheran worship is likely. A plausible theory is therefore that the part books were being used by multiple confessional groups with an alternative text offered for the atypical Marian phrases in a single Josquin setting, which nonetheless allowed Catholics to sing the text underlay as printed. It has also been suggested that the change offered flexibility of performance even within the demands of one confessional group. The Josquin Missa Beata Virgine offered laudatory Marian phrase appropriate to Marian feast, but less so to ordinary time. Alteration therefore made the setting usable beyond the Marian feasts. The Netherlands Music Institute copy of Norma et Insigne Opus Musicum, from Schneider 1537, presents a less ironic picture of the use than the Liber Quindecim. A superficial similarity is the focus of textual changes in mentions of Mary. These are motets, with more text over which to quibble, and more points of doctrinal tension than the words of the Mass Ordinary. Changes exist in each of the extant printed part books, but paleographical differences make it unlikely that the changes were made by the same person. Royston Gustafson has argued that the copy was used in a Latin school in Lower Saxony. Certainly, the erratic Latin and orthography in the uppermost part book strongly supports a juvenile annotator. As with the Liber Quindecim, the printed underlay has either been kept or just slightly struck through and remains legible. In Josquin's Praetoriarum Serium, direct Marian praise has been removed, privileging a focus on God. The printed phrase, God's providence which ordains all things, shifts to the praise of Mary, but in its amended form has been erased, and the praise of God is merely extended and sustained to pro divina sua sapientia, according to divine inspiration and his wisdom. The setting of Haec Dies by Senfel has been amended in 3 stages, each of which moves the sense further away from Mary towards Christ as seed, semen, and ultimately to the Lord God. First, the printed word femina, woman, has been changed from singular to plural, shifting the focus from a particular woman, Mary, to women in general. Secondly, femina has been struck through and replaced with semen, Christ. Specifically, it is Mary's role in salvation that has been obscured. The original text read, "Death which a woman carried in, a woman drove out," inferring that while a woman, Eve, ushered in sin, another woman, Mary, banished it. In the second change, semen fugavit, it is Christ as the seed who drives out sin. Finally, Dominus is introduced, replacing each cantillation of feminae. The change to Josquin's Benedicta est Celorum Regina likewise focuses on Mary, here with the epithet Queen of the Heavens, Celorum Regina, turning instead to the Trinity, Sancta Trinitatis. Here the printed underlay has not been cancelled, however, and the Trinitarian invocations are below the printed underlay, such that praise of Mary remains an option for the performer. The original text hymns Mary as Mother of God, a daughter of God, sanctified and sacred, and calls on her to intercede with Christ in heaven. In the emendation, it is the Trinity that is hymned, and Christ, the Son of God, who intercedes with his Father in heaven, independently of his mother. Only the bassos and the contratenor part books give an indication of the ways that singers actually performed emendations, in a later change to the same motet. Supplementary text has been written above the printed underlay, but with diagonal lines guiding the singer between the printed text and the manuscript, which therefore come together to form the composite text of the music. I've just quickly highlighted what's changed from what was "Now mother, pray to your son." It eventually becomes "O son, pray to your father, that he may take away our guilt." This minor word change nevertheless affects a significant change in meaning, whereby it is no longer the Virgin Mary who intercedes with her son on behalf of the believer, but the son who intercedes with his father. Now, this is probably the most common word change we've seen, or sort of meanings change we have seen across the books that we've examined. The same text, for example, is also amended in a different form in the Liber Selectarum Conditionum, I couldn't resist, printed in Augsburg in 1520. Here, the careful changes to Josquin's motet Benedicta est Celorum removes the image of the intercessor. So you can see on the left a copy from Vienna, in fact, or which hasn't got a change. And on the other side, in red underlined, the careful changes that have been made in the copy now in California. In Harvard. What these changes have done is change very slightly the text from "Blessed are you, Queen of Heaven." And then you can see the other text change here. I hope everyone can see this, where it says, "Now mother, pray to your son," to change to "You bore a son for us." The alteration replaces Marian intercession with a strictly Christological theology of salvation. Mary is no longer invoked as heavenly mediator, but commemorated as the historical mother of Christ. Sorry. Finally, here an example of a very different kind from the same book, again printed by Formschneider in Nuremberg, the one book we saw before, to show that these books were altered in various ways. The motet Christus Filius Dei Morte contains as printed phrase Carolo Cesare Romano, Charles the Holy Roman Emperor, which has been cancelled and replaced with Augusto Electore Nostro, so Augustus our elector. Charles V ruled as Holy Roman Emperor until 1558, and Elector August of Saxony came in, and so this is a change to him, helping us to date this volume. There's a sort of slight issue with moving my slides. The second most common interaction with the text we see are ways to clarify the text underlay on how to place it in the music. Various copies contain changes to the text underlay designed to refine syllable placement in relation to the notation. This comes in different forms. Sometimes, as in this copy in Braunschweig, dashes are added to indicate the placement of syllables. Additionally, extra syllables are entered. What's interesting about this particular instance is that we find this level of interaction only in the first piece and only in the superiors part. Might this have been used as a test case or as an educational piece? In other examples, there are a range of reasons the text underlay was added. Sometimes only the beginning of the well-known text is printed, so the annotator is supplying the missing words. This is particularly common in mass texts. We have quite a lot of instances in the Agnus. So far, that's the ranks highest in our supplication of text. On other occasions, the entire text is present, but where the syllable placement should be added is not clear. Here, dashes help or additional underlay. And here's another example where clearly, even though it looks fairly well placed, the reader was not agreeing with the text underlay and carefully replaced the text underlay in a different version. Without giving much detail, I want to mention briefly one further phenomenon we come across with quite a lot of frequency, especially as we're seeing more printed hymn publications. Many of the surviving copies, for example, of Rau's print publications, have the text of additional verses entered, interestingly often by various hands over a span of time. To conclude this section, it is certainly notable that, while perhaps not as frequent as originally anticipated, interactions with the text underlay, especially in motet, hymn, and mass publications, are some of the most common interactions we see. Among them, doctrinal changes seem strongly centered around the mention and more specifically the role of the Virgin Mary. There's an overwhelming sense of emendation rather than deletion, of keeping the book and the music usable rather than skipping or deleting pieces. Moreover, we have found multiple examples where we might infer the wish to allow for alternative readings to be sung while keeping the original text. Secondly, we have found some evidence of wanting to clarify text underlay with a great variety of approaches. These range from simply connecting printed words with notes to filling in the gaps or changing the underlay. This area will be one that Louisa will workshop next week with a group of singers, as text underlay is one of their main areas of concern when singing from original sources, and many of us have been there and have had the same concern. This neatly brings me to finally properly introducing Louisa, known to many of you. Louisa Huntry Bradley's work traverses the fields of musicology, print culture, and early modern history, focusing on the Low Countries. She has associations with the Planter Moretus Museum as music advisor. She's a classical music lead for the Alton Arts Festival and as the music program director at Jane Austen's house. Louisa also regularly gives concerts as a singer and recorder player. I think it's important for us to know her as a musician as much as a scholar, especially as her focus today will be specifically the interactions with the music that we found so far. So I will stop sharing my screen. I'll come back later. And Louisa can share hers. Is mine sharing yet or?
Yep,
not
yours
yet?
is all clear, Louisa.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for I can't see Louisa's screen yet. Can others? Matthew, do you see Louisa's presentation?
I see Louisa's screen, I think. Interactions with the music.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Is that a problem for other people?
Okay. Fine.
Okay.
I need to switch screens. Fine, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. So this section, as Elisabeth has stated, focuses specifically on interactions with the musical notation itself within these early printed music books. So to date, as Elisabeth stated, the project's examined at least 1,000 surviving copies of printed music books. Rather than presenting a full statistical analysis today, however, which of course will become more meaningful once the survey is complete, this paper introduces several representative examples of the types of interactions with the musical notation that have emerged from the copy analysis so far. So these examples serve as preliminary evidence through which we can begin to explore a number of broader research questions. Again, I know Elisabeth already spoke about some of the research questions, but these are slightly more specific to the music examples. So do the markings that we see occur more frequently in particular voice parts or at specific points within within a piece, for example? Or do variations reflect differences in an education of performer roles? Perhaps are there marks from either a teacher versus a student? We're also interested in, do certain marks occur at structural points, such as cadences or moments of alignment between voices? Are there particular markings associated with specific collections or groups of performers? And do these practices occur consistently across particular genres or repertoires? So using this copy-based approach has allowed us to compare markings across multiple surviving exemplars. In numerous cases, identical symbols appear in different copies. And our ability to examine copies held across Europe and North America has therefore made it possible for us to develop a preliminary framework for understanding both the types of markings that appear in these books and the frequency with which these occur. And we understand we're very lucky to be able to be looking at so many of these copies in person. So the first. So clef corrections occur relatively frequently. Typically, the original clef is struck through and a new clef inserted in the correct position, and usually in brown ink. Such corrections appear across multiple publishers and repertories, and I'm hoping that these red arrows can help navigate the marks of use that I'm discussing throughout this paper. From the copies examined so far, these corrections appear particularly often in German publications. Preliminary observations also suggest that these occur more frequently in the bassus part books rather than other voice parts. Further to this, clefs are sometimes inserted rather than corrected. An example appears in the tenor part of a chanson collection published by Attignon in 1528 and now preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Such interventions suggest that users were attentive readers of notation and willing to adjust this printed material if necessary, and this does happen quite frequently. Corrections to time signatures were also common. These corrections, as with the clef corrections, would correct this original symbol struck through and then replaced. The majority of corrections are then from imperfect to perfect tempus and will either take the form of changing the symbol, in this instance, taken from the bassus part of one of the Regensburg copies of the 1539 Limber Quindecim Misarum, or by writing the number 3, as can be seen on the first stave of the tenor part from the Hague copy of the Novum et Insignia Opus Musicum. Both of these publications have already provided useful evidence for other aspects of the project, as Elisabeth's already demonstrated, including the textual underlay, and they also will be used for other numerous interactions with the music notation itself. Relatively straightforward corrections also occur in relation to the rests. In one Hamburg copy of a Dorico publication, for example, the final rest appears to have been written over a previously erased symbol. Additional rests are also inserted in other copies, including the Discantus part of the Braunschweig copy of Rau's Responsorium. We then have corrections to individual notes, although somewhat less frequently than initially expected. These corrections may involve changes to pitch, alternations to rhythm values, or modifications to note stems. And in some instances, rests are added at the same time as pitch or rhythmic corrections, as one would expect. Examples appear across multiple publishers and genres. And one instance occurs in an Attignon chanson print, now in Paris, while another appears in a Petraeus collection of psalms held in Braunschweig, where both pitch and rhythmic values are corrected. We've got another example from a Hamburg copy of Dorico's motets from 1526 with these additional tails added to the stems to alter rhythmic interpretation. And here, not only is the stem crossed out, but the corrector also seemed quite unhappy with the length of the kustos at the end of the second stave. I find that quite entertaining. Occasionally, of course, we then have several corrections appearing on the same page, suggesting this sustained engagement with the printed notation. We've got another example of a correction here involving the removal of notes through scraping or washing away of ink. So such interventions are not unexpected. Similar practices occur in the correction of ownership inscriptions or textual underlay, as we've just seen. In the case of musical notation, scraping appears relatively frequently in Italian prints in particular. And so examples of this can be found in the previous Scotto edition preserved in Brussels, as well as the Dorico publication shown here, kept in Hamburg. A particularly distinctive pitch intervention involves short diagonal strokes added to either side of these note heads. These markings appear to indicate that the pitch of a note should be altered, typically by a tone. When the surrounding harmonic context is examined and when modern scholarly editions are consulted, thank you to many of you for such scholarly editions, these alterations generally correspond with expected musical solutions. In many cases, the marking affects a single note, though there are also instances where multiple notes appear to have been corrected in this way. Such markings are relatively common in the copies that we've examined so far. The addition of accidentals was another form of interaction anticipated at the outset of the project. And while accidentals do appear in many copies, they're far less frequent than expected. And I guess that's why we've got so many discussions still today about musica ficta and the like. It's still not clear enough in these original copies. When they are present, they often appear at cadential points, and I'm hoping that we'll find some more copies when we're interrogating the final copies for accidental changes. One type of intervention that proved unexpectedly common, however, involves corrections to the custodes, the guide notes placed at the end of the staff to indicate the pitch of the following line. And already during the first research trip that we did to Paris, several instances of corrected custodes appeared across different library collections, and similar examples have continued to emerge in subsequent repository work. These interventions, in fact, prompted me to reflect a little bit on the practical function of custos in performance. Just as an aside, I was preparing a Salieri Mass recently, and under the familiar conditions of limited rehearsal time, I found myself instinctively marking cues at page turns, writing in the next pitch of a phrase to come. And in doing so, I realised that this kind of prep work may not be so different now from the strategies employed back in the 16th century. So preliminary observation suggests that such corrections occur particularly often in German publications. I think this is a point that Elisabeth will be discussing further in this presentation. However, examples also appear in other repertories, including Dorico motets and Attignon chansons, demonstrating that the practice was not limited to a single regional tradition. A further category of interaction consists of numerical markings. Numbers are frequently written in above rests, ligatures or changes of time signature, apparently serving as counting aids. And these marks occur most commonly in passages where extended rests or complex mensural groupings might otherwise make rhythmic coordination difficult, or in fact, how many of us really wants to be that engaged with counting that number of rests, perhaps. Examples appear not only in part books, but also in choir book formats. One such instance occurs in the Vienna copy of the Liber Selectarum Cantionum, where very, very small numerical marks or annotations appear above passages of ligatures. And I just want to, in this one instance, to do a shout out to our newest member, Anna Louisa, who brought this attention to my attention just in this last week. The edition that provides particularly rich evidence for this practice is Petrus's Liber Quindecim Misarum, and the copy that's housed both in the British Library and also one of the copies in Regensburg here. So when comparing multiple copies of the same passage, you can see that similar numbering systems often appear, although not always in identical form. So here you can see that the Regensburg copy has additional numbers added on the top stave as well. Some copies contain only a few simple numbers, while others include more extensive counting systems. And then here, the arrows here highlight the small number of differences between these two copies. So even in such heavily, densely annotated section, there'll be small differences in what a user chooses to annotate for their own personal needs. Closely related to numerical annotations are these short vertical lines added above or through the staff, as seen with this example of both numbers and lines from the Hague copy of von Schneider's Novum et Insigne Opus Musicum. These markings often appear in groups of 3 and frequently coincide with changes in time signature. Their placement suggests that they may have been used to indicate triple groupings or to clarify the rhythmic structures of passages. Examples of this appear in several editions of Formschneider's Novum et Insigne, and again throughout the British Library copy of Petraeus's Liber Quindecim Misarum. Longer vertical lines resembling modern bar lines also appear in some of the copies seen to date. Of course, it's important to distinguish between the later pencil bar lines, often added by modern performers or editors, and earlier lines drawn in brown ink. The latter appear to represent early reader interventions. These lines typically extend across the staff and often occur at regular intervals, for example, every 4 minims in this case. From the material examined so far, such markings appear particularly often in upper voice parts, which may suggest a pedagogical context. Another category of markings consists of diagonal or horizontal lines placed across the music. At first glance, these markings may appear irregular, yet their placement is often highly consistent. In several cases, the same marks appear across all voice parts at identical locations within a piece. These points frequently coincide with cadences or other structurally significant moments, suggesting that these markings may have functioned as listening cues or indicators of ensemble coordination, as in this example from Rao's Responsorium. One particularly interesting example appears in a copy of Novum et Insigne held at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich. This is one that I've been preparing from for the workshops next week. So in this case, diagonal lines occur at cadential points across all parts, though only on the first 2 pages of each part book. This limited distribution may suggest once more a pedagogical function rather than a purely performance-related one. As is often the case with these analyses, the exact purpose is hard to ascertain. It is the never-ending question. Certain markings appear to serve analytical or explanatory purposes, taking the same piece that we just used to demonstrate the instance of diagonal lines. Here we see its presentation, this time extracted from a choir book format within the Boston copy of the 1520 Liber Selectarum Cantionem, but this time with signs resembling signa congruenzae. Such a sign also often appears at points of imitation or structural correspondence between voices, sometimes aligned with an instruction, such as fuga. And in other cases, explanatory annotations appear in the margins, as in this case of the copy of the Liber Quindecim Misarum held at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität Library in Munich. One notable example of this occurs in a copy marked up by Heinrich Larian, and further information about this can be found in Ian Fenlon and Inga Maigroth's 2013 publication, Heinrich Larian's books, The Intellectual World of a 16th Century Musical Humanist. In such cases, the markings appear to reflect analytical engagement with the music rather than purely practical performance preparation. Finally, one particularly striking marking involves small crosses placed above or below note heads. Stanley Bormans describes similar markings in early printed music as rehearsal indicators, and several examples appear in copies from the Nonsuch Music Library within the Lumley collection at the British Library. A reconstruction of this collection has been made and examined in detail by John Milsom, who identified original groupings of books using a wide range of evidence, including foliation, wormholes, stains, offsets, inventories, and 18th century library lists. And, of course, there are the names Arundel and Lumley present on many of the title pages as well. But there's another layer of evidence which can be seen through the consistent marks of use in these books that seem quite particular to this collection. The addition of crosses above and below note heads appear within 4 of the remaining 14 tract volumes that Milsom discusses in detail in his revised catalogue. These volumes include a collection of Liber Cantionem Sacrarum, published by Falaise the Elder, a collection of chansons also from Falaise, and Gardano books of madrigals composed by Cipriano de Rore. But the most extensive examples occur in a tract volume containing Susato prints of chansons. And here is an example of how many of the editions within that tract volume include these cross symbols at the note heads. So within this set of books, the crosses appear frequently across all voice parts and often multiple times within a single piece, as you can see by the sea of red arrows here. From this example, from the 5th book of Chansons, one can see that the marks are executed in a consistent style, suggesting that they may have been added by a single reader or group of users working with the collection as a unified set. In several instances, the placement of the cross coincides with movements where an entry or important melodic movement occurs in another voice, as shown in these mock-ups in score format. The marking may therefore have functioned as a listening cue for ensemble coordination. And here's another quick example, from this time from the 7th book of Chansons, again within the Susato set, once again demonstrating the movement of parts at the point of marking. The consistency of these marks across the collection demonstrate the idiosyncrasies that one can find within a particular collection, where their own conventions evolved and where a specific marking might signify something quite different or defined to those particular users or readers. So several broader observations emerge from the copy analysis completed thus far. Interaction with music is genre independent. So unlike textual annotation, musical markings occur across genres. That regional differences exist. German publications frequently show custos corrections, for example. Italian prints often show scratched out notes. And although not covered in this particular presentation, we've also noticed that French prints sometimes display decorative ruling features, possibly at the time of production or binding. Certain voice parts are more heavily annotated than others. Possible explanations might be that the tenor might be functioning as a structural anchor or teacher or leader. A superius might be showing signs of teaching or learning. Many annotations function as performance aids or educational tools, sorry for that typo. So such as these counting numbers or vertical grouping marks, for example. Marking conventions may be collection specific. Some sets of books show distinct annotation systems unique to their users, such as the crosses found in the Nonsuch Music Library. And not all volumes in a sammelband or tract volume are annotated, suggesting a selective use of repertory or in some cases a later binding of originally separate books. So we've seen that a comparison of multiple surviving copies reveals several important patterns in the transmission and use of these printed music books. In some cases, identical markings made across different copies, and in others, annotations only in individual copies or at varied points from copy to copy, indicating that they were likely added by readers or performers at various stages of the life of the music book. In addition to these early layers of interaction, many copies also contain later pencil markings, which may reflect, of course, the activities of modern performers or editors preparing the material for performance or for the creation of modern editions. But taken together, these multiple layers of annotation demonstrate the complex and ongoing histories of use embedded within surviving printed music books. Finally, the next phase of the project involves practice-based workshops next week with leading performer scholars Capella Pratensis, hosted by the Alamire Foundation at the House of Polyphony and funded by the Willison Foundation Trust. Here, I'll be taking mock-ups of some of these annotated copies for us to study. And the goals of these workshops are to test how these historical annotations function in performance, to explore how singers interact with these annotated copies versus clean copies, and also to evaluate whether these markings such as numbers or crosses, accidentals and so on improve rehearsal efficiency. Discussions with colleagues who regularly perform from menstrual notation suggest that performers today are often reluctant to mark historical sources directly, partly because of an assumption that early modern singers, given their training, would not have required such aids. But we suspect that this research will challenge such assumptions, as the evidence within these books that, as we've just seen, also already suggests that the performers actively adapted notation to practical needs. They developed individual and collective systems of annotation and used printed books as working documents rather than fixed texts. So by combining the material evidence found within the DORMEME study to date with this practice-based research next week, the workshop seeks to understand better the historical relationship between notation, reading, and musical performance. Wish us luck. Back to you now, Elisabeth.
I'm sharing my screen. Louisa, can you confirm you're okay to see this?
I'm not struggling.
You see it? Fine? Great. Now, just a very brief final point from me. We'll be within the hour before we go to the discussion. So for my short final contribution, I chose to focus on in-house corrections. So we'll move to this, and the proofreader as the first reader. This might seem somewhat counterintuitive for a project that focuses on consumption and reading and might more belong to the production area, because of course in-house corrections done in printing houses arguably are part of the production process. However, there are three main reasons why we've chosen to find it useful and necessary to address this topic in this context. First, in-house corrections are very common and more common than we assumed across the board. Secondly, they aren't as uniform or easily recognizable as one might think, often leaving questions of what was in-house versus later corrections. And finally, in the context of thinking about reading music, we might want to consider the proofreader as the first reader. What did he or she consider worth correcting? What were their priorities to making the book correct and readable? And why did they focus on certain areas and types of corrections? To make sure the book looks correct, or did they have a use in mind? Now to the first point, how widespread they were. In general, errors and the avoidance of errors was a hugely important part of early modern book production. Many printers, authors, publishers were concerned about the correctness of their work. Prefaces, title pages, and errata lists tell us the story of this concern. That this was also the case among music printers is not surprising. Many of the music printers printed all type of material. However, proofreading music came with its specific challenges, from having a suitable proofreader to the peculiarity of printing in parts, to the fact that even a musically very knowledgeable proofreader might not be spotting a mistake purely by reading through it. So that's of course different to a text. If you were capable of a language and read in that language and there were typographical errors, you can spot them by reading it. This is much, much harder for music. Levels of proofreading and in-house corrections vary significantly between publishers, often even between individual editions, depending on the involvement of certain personnel. We knew from the painstaking work of Stanley Borman, for example, that Petrucci had a very involved in-house correction system, although we've also learned from his work that it varied considerably between publications and even often between individual prints. And even he was often left puzzling with what was done in-house, and I remember these discussions fondly. What we did not expect to see were some elements of in-house corrections in so many of the books we looked at. It is a particular luxury of the project to be able to compare many examples of the same publication, then many publications of the same printers, and then many publications of various printers. And when we combine them with the corrections in books by the same publisher, we see certain patterns emerging. I will focus in particular on the books printed by Petraeus briefly and Rao, first because they both show signs of significant in-house corrections over a longer period of time, and secondly because many of those are anthologies, where the involvement of the author or composer in the proofreading process is very unlikely, so we're actually talking about a proofreader in-house rather than the composer proofreading it. Across our data, we see a variety of methods for in-house corrections at work, including pastovers, deletions, scratching, and manual corrections by ink. The last are the least obvious in terms of recognizing them, but they are certainly also the most common. This brings me to the second point, the variability of in-house corrections. While pastovers are easily identified as in-house, corrections in brown ink are more difficult, especially if they're also not done in the same manner. Now, some are fairly obvious, and we've seen those before. Here, the custos change in the final line. The amount of times we've discussed custodies in this project is quite ridiculous, but because they are so frequent, we're trying to understand, is this an in-house correction? Is it or not? Is it a performance mark in some way? Now, these are very straightforward, and basically, once you see a correction made in a very similar way across different copies from different provenance, you can probably assume it's an in-house correction. The other one very frequently seen done in a similar way are these lowering of pitches, especially in Petraeus. Other corrections, though, make us stop. In this case, for example, clearly the two semi-briefs were not necessary. So when we found multiple examples with stems added in brown ink to turn them into minims, that seemed like an in-house correction. However, in other copies, the problem was solved differently. Here, for example, by simply deleting one of the semi-briefs. Now, how does this happen? How is the same mistake corrected in different ways, and why? We could be looking at a group of proofreaders who might be working off a printed errata sheet or a handwritten errata sheet, correcting a mistake but not in the same way. Or in some cases, we've wondered whether multiple people were using these books together and all noticed a mistake and corrected them in different ways, similar to what we've seen in Susan's work, for example, for school books. Some books were probably corrected in-house where others weren't corrected. Proofreading and printing is a messy process. It wasn't a case that all were sort of proofread and then sent out. So it could be that some were proofread in the house and others hadn't been proofread and the mistake was later noticed. Or it could be, in some cases, that different users came to the very same conclusion at the same points in the book, but solved them in different ways. And basically, by knowing more and more books, the likelihood of that reduces when you see it in many different copies. There are also corrections where a first instance doesn't really look like a proofreading correction in any way. They look haphazard or done differently, but if we find them in many of the different copies with very, very different origins, we then still have to consider whether it was some form of in-house change. Why does this matter for us in this project or for anyone working on interaction with music books? First, there's just the obvious danger to interpret an in-house correction as a user interaction. That happened to us a lot at the beginning. The first time you see it, you think it might be user interaction, and then in fact can frequently lead to a wrong assumption. And vice versa, what might seem like an in-house correction could in fact not be one. The only solution to that is to see as many copies as possible and to form a bigger picture. The other benefit we now have is to start combining the knowledge of frequency of what is proofread and what isn't by certain publishers. The third point takes us in a slightly different direction. If we consider the work of a proofreader as that of the first reader, it might help us to understand ways of reading music and also the priorities of readers. Simply put, what did a music proofreader consider worthy of correction? What did they look out for? And what might that matter for the reader? If we take the example of portrayals, where we have a large sample of what can fairly certainly be described as in-house corrections now, the first point is they all pertain to the music. There's not a single change made to the text underlay or the liminal material, not when there are mistakes, not when the text underlay is fairly bitty. Within the music, it is predominantly corrections of pitch and quite frequently custodis. Sometimes we send changes to the rests and clefs and time signatures, very similar to the things we've seen from Louisa as well. This mirrors what we've seen in other cases. Hardly ever is there an interaction with the text that we can say is a proofreading or an in-house interaction, even if the underlay is messy. A clear focus is on the pitch, then custodis, clefs, and rests. This gives rise to two further questions. First, how did they proofread? My personal assumption is more than with other types of text that they had to read it against a copy text. Identifying a wrong pitch in a single line in a part book would be difficult to do for anyone. Secondly, that clefs and custodis were very easy to spot at the beginning and end of lines. That they took care to correct them also suggests they considered them important to the readers, another hypothesis Louisa will test with her group of singers. Finally, we can show that these priorities of our proofreaders, as we have so far outlined them, are also mirrored in some of the printed errata sheets for music. Here an example for Rao, who equally focuses on the correct musical readings. Interestingly, to read his corrections is in fact very similar to reading our database. Things like, in the third verse, there's an additional rest in the second line. Very neat here, the one where he actually reprints how it should properly be read. These examples of in-house corrections really highlight the continuum between the production and the use of music books, with the potential use and the users, of course, already being an integral part of the production process. And this relationship between production and use, which really is not an either-or, but a continuum, brings us back to the very beginning of my talk, and thus also to its end. We thank you all so much for your attention and look forward to discussions and interactions. Thank you.
Well, congratulations. What a wonderful project. Tremendous material, beautifully presented. I'm sure many of us will be grateful for the recording this time to be able to go through it a little more slowly and spend a little more time looking at the examples. But thank you all so much.